Australia was the only major Western nation to avoid large-scale economic downturn after the events of the global financial crisis, and the reason why has its roots in the foundation of all economics and politics in every capitalist nation. Hello Internet, here's a quick economic analysis of Australia and the global financial crisis. Obligatory disclaimer, this is hugely simplified. Check out the sources in the doobly-doo to find out more. The global financial crisis, or GFC for short, was a period of large-scale economic stress across the globe between 2007 and 2009, arising from a downturn in the US housing market. The exact origins of this crisis are still hotly debated by various economists, but there are still a few major points of general consensus. Excessive optimism in the US housing market plus a lack of regulation of the banks led to banks giving subprime mortgages. Thus, when America's unemployment began to rise, many of these subprime mortgage recipients lacked the means to repay the banks. Therefore, when the banks had to seize thousands upon thousands of houses and resell them immediately, the US housing market crashed, and the US economy whole did as well. And as the saying goes, when the US gets a cold, the whole world sneezes. The vast majority of countries are either producers or consumers of American goods and services. That means the GFC happened. Despite Australia being as inextricably tied to the US economy as anyone else, Australia avoided a large-scale economic downturn and a recession. The reason why is one of the most contested debates in Australian economics. And on one side, there are those who believe there was government action that prevented the effects of the GFC, and on the other side, it was those that believe it was extra governmental affairs that prevented the recession. Some go as far to say that it was the government action that actually degraded the Australian economy. What was the government's reaction actually? The government obviously has a vested interest in the Australian economy and thus took multiple measures to prevent the economic downturn. But the prolific action, and the most prolific action, was the stimulus package of the Rudd government, which gave $950 Australian to each income earner who earned less than $80,000 in the year of 2007 to 2008. This program cost the government $52 billion. There are many papers who go into depth as to why the stimulus package prevented Australia's recession, but Chris Barrett's Australia and the Great Recession provides a clear and digestible argument as to why the government reforms worked, with simple graphs. Essentially, he, and others like him, argued that the stimulus package boosted the economy as it resulted in households redistributing their newfound disposable income back into the economy, which helped producers keep the number of consumers high. This maintenance of consumer demand for products, i.e. theoretically, kept businesses afloat, and thus sustained the employment of those in said businesses. Those against the stimulus package argue that the reason why Australia escaped the GFC largely depended on its international relations. Articles like Kevin Rudd Did Not Save the Economy in 2008 by Tony Mackin and The Effectiveness of Federal Fiscal Policy, a review also by Tony Mackin, even argue that by increasing the budget deficit, the value of Australian exports had decreased, thus damaging the economy in the long term. The quite scathing report by Tony Mackin states that federal fiscal stimulus was used aggressively, ultimately ineffectively, in response to the GFC centered on North Atlantic economics. One argument states that it was the China-Australia partnership that kept Australia alive. Despite the GFC, China continued to demand Australia's exports, thus stabilizing the economy as Australian producers were still turning profit. What this means is that employers could rely on the relatively stable Chinese economy as opposed to the failing US economy, and thus continue to employ people at the same rate as before. Another argument centers on the value of the Australian dollar, and how the federal fiscal stimulus ultimately incurred great deals of foreign debt. The government previous to Kevin Rudd's Labour government had decided to reduce taxation and save very little during the boom season of the economy. This meant when the Labour government decided to implement the stimulus package, the government had to borrow great deals of foreign economies and foreign debt. What Mackin argues is that this resulted in Australian dollar becoming far more unstable as investors in foreign economies began questioning Australia's ability to repay these loans. Unsurprisingly, this economic debate once again comes down to the age-old economic battle between Hayek and Keynes. If we assume that economic booms and busts are inevitable, then what is the correct course of political action? Do we, as Hayek argued, ride out the bust cycle, decreasing taxes during the booms and saving every penny when bust occurs? Or should we be more Keynesian and tax lightly during the peak of the economy and spend greatly on welfare when the market looks bearish? To Keynes or to Hayek? That is the question. I hope you learned something from this video, guys. Remember, see you, Space Cowboy.